Your lecturer is Dr. J. L. Garfield. Dr. Garfield is Doris Silbert Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Smith College. He also teaches philosophy at the University of Massachusetts, Melbourne University, and India's Central University of Tibetan Studies. Professor Garfield is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 16 books. Among these are the Oxford Handbook of World Philosophy and Buddhist Philosophy Essential Readings.
Greetings. My name is Jay Garfield. It's very nice to meet you. Normally, you can find me at Smith College in Massachusetts, where I teach philosophy, but I also teach at the University of Melbourne in Australia and the Central University of Tibetan Studies in India. But for the next 36 lectures, I'm with you, which means I get to travel even more than I ordinarily do. We'll be talking about the meaning of life. It's one of the big questions, of course, maybe the biggest question. And the reason that I do philosophy in the first place is because it allows us to ask the very big questions. So I hope that you enjoy our exploration as we try to really sort out the answer to this biggest of all. What is the meaning of life? Now, when we begin by asking the question, what is the meaning of life, we need to start by asking a prior question. And that is what we mean by the very phrase, the meaning of life. Because in philosophy, we're trying to think reflectively, and we often have to move back a step before we can move forward. Let's begin with the word meaning itself. The word meaning has got itself many meanings. We can distinguish at least three meanings that are going to be important for us here. The first and most obvious is what we might call linguistic meaning or semantic meaning. This is when we talk about the meaning of words. So we might say, for instance, that the word bachelor in English means an unmarried adult male. Or we might say that the words rouge and red and marpeau mean the same things in French, English, and Tibetan, respectively. That's one very good sense of meaning. We have a second sense of meaning that we sometimes talk about, and that is what we might call indicative meaning. So I might look up at the sky and say, those clouds mean rain. Or that expression on her face means trouble. There we're not talking about linguistic meaning or semantic meaning. The clouds aren't literally signs or symbols in a language, and we're not trying to interpret them. Rather, what we mean is they indicate to us that it's going to rain. That scowl on her face indicates that she's lost her temper. So those are at least two senses of meaning. But there's a third sense of meaning. The third sense of meaning is the sense of meaning where we might talk about significance, something being important to us. So I might say, talking to you, this ring is of great meaning to me. It signifies or it represents my marriage vows. Or I might say, the monument I visited today on the National Mall is deeply significant. It resonates with me. It gives me a certain sense of value and importance. It's the third of these, this notion of significance, that's clearly the core meaning when we ask the question, what is the meaning of life? I said it's the core meaning, but it's not the only meaning. For we are indeed asking why life is significant, why it's important, why it matters to us. But the others are important too. And you'll discover, especially later in this course, when we move to Native American perspectives, we're going to actually be trying to understand our own lives and things around us as linguistically meaningful, as indicative in important ways. For now, though, let's notice that all three of these senses of meaning, even though they're different from one another, are related to one another in an important way. Because in each case, we're talking about the sense of pointing to something outside. When we think about linguistic meaning, we mean that the word red points to or denotes or expresses the color redness, which is outside of the word itself. When I say that my ring is significant, that is, that it's meaningful to me in this way, I'm saying that it points to or refers outside to marriage commitments or something like that. And finally, When I say that those clouds mean rain, I mean that by looking at those clouds, I get information about something beyond them. So all of these senses of meaning have a sense of one thing pointing to or indicating something well beyond it. And in general, when we ask the question, what is the meaning of life? We're asking the question, what is it beyond our existence that gives our lives significance, that makes it indicate anything? That's one question we need to ask preliminarily. But there's certainly another one, because we began by asking the question, what is the meaning of life? That raises a prior question. Is there a meaning of life in the first place? And this is a question that we all ask ourselves and ask it in different ways at different developmental stages. When we're young children, maybe when we're lying awake in bed and we suddenly realize that, we're just one person among many, and our parents know a whole lot more than we do, and our grandparents are very old, and some of our friends are nice and some aren't, we might ask ourselves, what's this all about? Famously, of course, when we hit adolescence, we begin to ask this question in a deep and existential way. What am I here for? What is my life going to be? And as we grow older, with hope and a little philosophy, we hope that we ask more reflectively and in a larger, less egocentric way, not just what's the meaning of my life, what's the meaning of our lives, what's the meaning of existence, what's it all about? So at different stages of our lives, we think about these things very differently. But we do have to ask the question, does life have meaning? And the answer to that might be no. Because after all, there are some things that simply don't have any meaning at all. After all, there are some rocks in my garden right now that I know are absolutely meaningless. And it might well be that human life is something more like my rocks than it is like my wedding ring. It may be one of those just plain meaningless things, full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. We just don't know that. And the other issue, of course, is that some lives might mean more than other lives. That is, we might say that certain lives are meaningful, but some lives are just plain meaningless. That's a reasonable possibility. If that's so, we can still ask the question, what does make a life worth living? What makes some lives more meaningful than others? What is it about those lives that are meaningful that makes them meaningful, and those lives that are meaningless that makes them meaningless? And that question is one we can ask even if it's a difficult question to answer. And so even if we were to discover that not all lives are meaningful, that life isn't meaningful per se, it may well be that we can still say in what the meaning of life consists for those lives that have meanings. Another question we might ask ourselves. What raises the question of the meaning of life in the first place? Why is this one of the questions that we feel absolutely bound to answer? And there are several things that raise that question. One that we find that raises that question throughout the history of philosophy, whether we're talking about European philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, African philosophy, is a fundamental awareness that human beings develop at some point of our finitude in a vast and infinite universe. That we are very small, limited, and ephemeral phenomena in a universe that goes far beyond us. That finitude has several different dimensions. On the one hand, there is the obvious finitude in space and time itself. If you think about the expanse of the world and the universe in which we live, it is quite vast. The globe that we dwell on right now is enormous. It is dwarfed by the solar system, a solar system that is no more than a speck in a galaxy, and a galaxy that is one of billions in a galaxy cluster. And as we extend our gaze across the universe, in the vastness of time, from the Big Bang to the eventual cooling of the universe, the amount of space and the amount of time that any one of us occupies is so tiny and so insignificant that we could well ask, who cares? But even if we restrict our gaze and get a little less cosmic and just think about human history, we see that we're very small moments. We're here for a few years, maybe even 100 years if we're lucky. But in the course of human history, which extends over hundreds of thousands of years already, That's absolutely nothing. We know that even if our children may remember us, maybe our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will look at photographs and ask, who was that? And people might say, I don't know, somebody who was a member of our family at some point. Most of us are not going to be remembered. And so we need to ask, what is it about our ephemeral lives in human history that makes them worth living in the first place? Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can think about the question about human life, even within this context. One of the things that we need to ask if we're asking about the meaning of life is just what it is for life to be a human life. Because after all, we're not here asking about the meaning of the life of dogs, or the life of snails, or even the life of chimpanzees and mountain gorillas close to us in the evolutionary tree though they may be. We are looking explicitly at the meaning of human life. So we need to ask at some point, what is it that makes us characteristically human in the respect that is relevant to asking this question? One possibility is that the answer to that is biological. If the answer is biological, then we would be saying that what it is to be human is perhaps to have a certain kind of DNA, to have a certain genetic code, or perhaps it's to have certain organs. Most of us might point first to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. We might say to be human is to be biologically like us, to be genetically related to us, to have the kind of functioning organs that we do, and ask, what is it about that biological nature that's important and significant? And as we will see, certain of the figures who we are going to examine in the history of philosophy are going to be paying attention to our biological constitution. On the other hand, we might think that the answer to the question, what makes us distinctively human, is a psychological answer. We might say it's not the meat, it's not the biology, it's not the brain stuff, it's how we think. It's what goes on in our minds. It's what we're capable of deducing, the intentions we're capable of forming, and so forth. And so we might even say, even if something were biologically different from us, maybe a Martian, but who was psychologically like us, that thing would be human in all relevant respects, and we could ask about the meaning of its life just as we could the meaning of our life, even though it's biologically distinct from us. On the other hand, of course, if you thought the answer was biological, you might say, who cares about the Martians? I care about people who are biologically like us, even if they're psychologically unlike me, even if they're severely disabled, comatose, or whatever. Those answers pull in different directions. We might give a spiritual answer to that question. We might say that what makes somebody distinctively human involves something like their relationship to a deity, their relationship to a religious practice, to a religious tradition, or something like that, something that transcends biology and psychology and is somehow a deeper fact. Or we might say that there's a moral dimension to humanity, and that what makes our lives meaningful is our capacity for caring about each other, for understanding the difference between right and wrong, for standing under moral imperatives, and for taking responsibility for our actions. And we might say that anything, biologically, psychologically, spiritually different from us, however different it may be, if it's morally like us, that's the kind of thing whose life is significant. I promise you that as we work through this series of lectures, we are going to find each of these answers taken seriously. Another question gets raised before we can begin to ask the big question. And that is the question, to what extent are we in control of our lives? Because many people would say that our life is meaningful only to the extent that we are able to do something with it. But after all, what kinds of things are we? If we're biological animals made of flesh and blood in a deterministic universe, it may be that everything that we do and everything that happens to us is completely causally determined. Or it might be that we're free and that we have a deep free will. In either case, our lives might be meaningful or meaningless, but the sense of meaning is going to be very different. Of course, on the other hand, it might be that we can find a middle path, that certain things about us are determined, but certain things about our lives are free. Perhaps the meaning lies in the places where we can make choices. We'll see that possibility raised in the Bhagavad Gita very shortly. But it might be that the meaning lies in exactly how we're determined. It might be, for instance, that it's what God has in mind for us that makes our lives meaningful. All of these questions will require being raised. Now, there's yet another important question to ask. We have been presuming so far, and unfortunately presuming that there might be a single right answer to the question, is there a meaning of life? And if so, what its meaning, what that meaning is. But that might not be true. There might be many meanings of life. There may be many different answers. For instance, the answer might vary over time. It might be that in one era, the meaning of life is one thing, but in another era, perhaps a more technological era, it's a different thing. It may be that what makes a life meaningful for a small child is different from what makes life meaningful to an adult, different again from what makes life meaningful to an elderly person. So meaning may vary not only over cultural time, but it might vary over individual time. Meaning might vary from culture to culture. We might say that what the meaning of life for somebody growing up in classical India is different from the meaning of life growing up in modern Europe, different again from the meaning of life growing up in contemporary United States. That's a possibility we will have to investigate, and we will certainly see many different answers to the question of the meaning of life that come from different times, different cultures, and individuals at different stages of their own lives. What would count as an answer if we even knew what the question was to the question, what is the meaning of life? We're going to need to think about that. One kind of answer might be this. It might be taking very seriously that problem of our finitude and the infinitude of the universe, that the only thing that could be an answer to the meaning of life question would be some account of the relationship between finite beings like us and a vast infinite universe. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, we take the spiritual dimension to humanity more seriously, that the only possible answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, is an answer that gives us some sense of what our relationship is to a divinity, to a God, to a greater spiritual existence. By the way, we're going to see each of those kinds of answers offered. When we look, for instance, a bit later on to people like Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics, we're going to see people trying to understand the meaning of life in terms of our relationship to the eternal cosmos. When we look, on the other hand, at the Bhagavad Gita, at the book of Job, we're going to be interested more in our relationship to a divinity. But there are other possibilities too. We might be asking about the relationship of our own lives to the lives of those around us, to our immediate past, to our ancestors, and to those who come after us. We will certainly see social accounts of the meaning of life, both in the Confucian tradition, in the Native American tradition, that are going to place a very special importance on the relationship between our own lives, the lives of our ancestors, and the lives of our children, in determining what could make our own lives meaningful, as well as accounts in the words of people like Aristotle, who are going to see the meaning of our life constituted primarily by our relationship to our own contemporary communities. There's two big dimensions that we need to consider as we pose the big question of the meaning of life. And these two dimensions are going to animate our discussion throughout this series of lectures. One I'm going to call the personal dimension, and one I'm going to call the collective or the relational dimension. When we ask the question in the personal dimension, we're asking the question, if I simply think of myself as an individual worrying about my own life, in what does the meaning of my life consist? We might have a number of different kinds of answers to that. We might say, a meaningful life for me is a life of reason. That is, it's a life that is led reflectively, thoughtfully, where I make my choices in an informed way, where I've got good reasons for the things that I do, and I can look back on my life and say, yes, I did the right things, and I did them for the right reasons. On the other hand, it might be that I say, for me, a meaningful life would be a life of faith, a life in which I find some higher value, some spiritual value, and am able to accommodate myself and my concerns to what I see as the dictates of that higher spiritual value. That's possible. On the other hand, I might say that what makes my life meaningful is that I'm able to lead it naturally, in harmony with my own nature, in harmony with the nature that I find around me, where I think of myself fundamentally as an organism, and I try to shed social accretions, get back to my natural way of being, and live that way. We're going to see this valorized, for instance, by the Taoists and by certain Zen thinkers when we move to that part of the Asian tradition. Or I might say, for instance, from a Confucian or an Aristotelian, that what gives my life meaning is that it's a social life, that I'm a member of a culture, a member of a society, a member of a family. Or perhaps I could say with Nietzsche, as we'll see further on, that what makes my life meaningful as an individual is that I lead an independent life, that I am the author of my own life, I create it as a piece of art, and I don't worry about the demands of others, the demands of society around me, or external values. I make my own values, and I make myself, and that kind of autonomy and individuality is what gives my life meaning. That's one dimension. But beyond this individual dimension, there's a second social dimension to thinking about the meaning of life, this dimension of connectedness. And in that dimension, we need an account of what our relationships are to each other, to the broader world, to the universe, to our society, in order to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? On this dimension, we might ask the question, are we primarily independent agents in voluntary association with one another? That is, when we think about our society, is it a group of individuals who get together and say, let's form a society and make some agreements, as we might see in the social contract tradition, where we see government and social institutions as constituted and legitimated by the wills of individuals. Or it might be that we are essentially social beings, that that's what our fundamental nature is, and that when we think about ourselves as individuals, that's no more appropriate than it is to think of my hand as an individual instead of as a part of my body. For Aristotle, for Confucius, we will think of ourselves primarily in a social context, whereas we'll see that for Kant and Mill, we'll think of ourselves primarily as individuals and of social contexts as built out of individuals. Do we choose our roles in society, or does society give us our roles? Or is our context not primarily social, but natural? Are we fundamentally animals living in an ecosystem? And so that what gives our lives meaning is our connection to other animals and plants in that broader ecosystem. We will see that kind of question asked by such thinkers as the Taoists and also by Native American thinkers like Lame Deer. Or, as the Stoics might have it, are we simply tiny parts of a very vast cosmos, and that we need to think of ourselves relationally in relation to the whole? All of these possibilities are going to be open for us in this set of lectures. Each one of them will be fascinating, and I promise you, we will not need to make choices, saying this one is right, this one is wrong. Rather, the beauty of doing philosophy this way is we'll be able to draw insight, inspiration, and understanding from each of these perspectives, and to see that by bringing a vast network of texts, a vast network of thinkers together, we can shed more light on our question and gain deeper insight than we can by only looking through a single lens. Now I want to talk with you a little bit about what it is to do philosophy. That's what I do with my life, and it's a really good life, I must say, and it's a life that I look forward to sharing with you. When I do philosophy, I always think of myself as part of a great philosophical tradition. And it's important to think of that tradition, I believe, not simply as, say, the Western tradition beginning in Greece and going to New York today or something like that, but rather to think of it as a global tradition of philosophy. Because philosophy has been done all around the world for thousands of years. So the philosophical tradition that I invite you to inhabit with me is a philosophical tradition that has roots in Greece, but also in China, also in India, also in Africa, also in pre-European North America. All of these areas are going to contribute to our thinking. And when we do philosophy with a tradition, that means paying attention to, listening to, and taking seriously the thinking of those who went before us, those who contributed to that tradition. Taking a text seriously and taking a tradition seriously means taking reading seriously. And reading isn't just a matter of running one's eyes over the page and being able to say what the text was about. Reading is a very complex skill in philosophy that needs to be learned. One of the things that we're going to see is that different traditions compose their texts in very different literary styles, and so demand of us different kinds of reading. For instance, we're going to be encountering texts that are written in epic poems. Those require a certain kind of interpretation and a certain kind of wondering what is left for the reader to understand. Some texts that we're going to see are kind of dry philosophical treatises, offering detailed arguments. Some are highly evocative, tiny bits of poetry where the reader is left to construct the argument. In each of these cases, learning how to do philosophy is not just learning how to think, but learning how to read with these traditions. So while sometimes I am going to lecture to you and just tell you about what's going on in these texts and offer you my interpretations, very often I'm going to treat you the way that I treat my own students at Smith or at Sarnath in India or in Melbourne. And what I like to do with my students is to invite them into my office, to sit down at my table with a book open in front of us and to read together. And I will often invite you into my office in exactly that way to read with me. Because part of what I want to teach you, maybe even the most important thing that you will learn over the next 36 lectures, is to learn how to read in these various traditions. In order to do this, it's not important for you only to learn what's said in these great texts, to learn what these people thought, but to learn how to read. Why do I hope that? Because I hope that your interest in this problem, and I hope that your interest in this literature doesn't end with the conclusion of this course. That would be a tragedy. So I hope that you are going to be thinking about the meaning of life and reading philosophy long into the future, even without me being present. And if that's so, you need to learn the skill of reading. And so the most important thing that I hope you will learn is how to approach these texts, read them, and draw understanding from them. So we'll spend a certain amount of time, as I like to put it, getting textual. There will be some surprises in this course, and some of those will be cross-cultural surprises. We're going to begin by visiting classical India to read the Bhagavad Gita. Then we're going to move to Greece with the work of Aristotle. These cultures might seem very different from our own, but in each case, we're going to find accounts of life that's made meaningful through understanding, through reflective thought, life that's made meaningful through careful self-cultivation. And we're going to find accounts according to which human happiness is indeed achievable through our own deliberate choices and our own actions. These accounts are therefore going to seem surprisingly familiar, even though they're culturally distant. But our third stop is going to be in the Hebraic tradition, looking at the foundations of religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And you might think that that's where things are going to feel familiar. We'll be reading the book of Job, though, so you should be prepared that things might be surprisingly foreign. While abroad, we found happiness attainable through our own activities. At home, in Job, happiness might not be in the cards at all. And we might even find that our own human agency really doesn't matter all that much at all, certainly much less than we'll see it mattering in India and Greece. So here's the plan. We're going to embark together on a global exploration of the question, what is the meaning of life? And my hope is that you are going to find, as I have found throughout my life, that some of the ideas from some of the most distant cultures and unexpected sources will seem the most familiar and the least exotic, and thus open our horizons to appreciating the wisdom and the understanding in these extraneous cultures. I also hope that you're going to find that some of the ideas we encounter closest to home, not only biblical ideas, but also ideas in modern Europe and in postmodern Europe, are going to be some of the most surprising, some of the ideas that we find most unusual and difficult to grapple with. And that will remind us that even where we feel most comfortable in our home cultures and our home traditions, we may be alienated from, unaware of currents in our own thinking, our own thought, and our own orientation that deep philosophical reflection can bring to the surface and allow us to problematize. So what's our route going to be? As I said, we're going to begin in India and in Greece and in the Middle East with the Hebrew Bible. From there, we're going to move to China and Japan, looking at the Taoist tradition, the Confucian tradition, and later on the Zen Buddhist tradition. We'll move then on to European modernity, to the work of people like Hume, Kant, and Mill, and then join the postmodern turn when we examine the critical philosophy of writers such as Tolstoy and Nietzsche. We'll conclude in what I call the postmodern globalized world and its re-engagement with the classical tradition, looking at the 20th and 21st century at the work of people like Mahatma Gandhi, the 14th Dalai Lama, and the great Native American philosopher Lame Deer. So now a word about the text where we're really going to begin. We're going to start with the Bhagavad Gita. That will be our very next lecture. It's a poetic text. It's a song. The word Gita means song, and it comes from ancient India. It's an academic text. It's not an academic text. It's a beautiful poetic text. Our second text, though, is an academic text. It's in fact a set of lecture notes. The Nicomachean Ethics, though it's attributed to Aristotle, is in fact lecture notes taken by his student Nicomachus. And then we're going to be reading an old book from the Hebrew Bible. These are very different texts from one another. We're going to start elsewhere with the most unfamiliar and allow ourselves to problematize familiarity. What I'm hoping is that you will see that these three texts offer dramatically different perspectives, and that you're going to see these perspectives repeated in later approaches, in different variations, developed in different ways. They will also introduce us to three very different ways of reading: reading poetry, reading lecture notes, reading the Bible. And that's going to give us a sense of the complexity of that task of reading. This will give us a very broad framework that will place subsequent texts in their context. So I'm hoping that you will join me in our very next lecture when we open the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, and examine Arjuna's fundamental choice and what it is for us to choose in context. We're starting there not because it's the oldest of our texts, but because it's got some of the oldest roots, and it addresses almost every issue we're going to think about. It might seem exotic at first, but I think that you're going to find it's familiar in some very startling ways. So I will see you in the next lecture for the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you very much.